At 5:12 in the morning, most of San Francisco was still asleep. Children were tucked into beds, bakers were lighting their ovens, horses stood quietly in their stalls. It was April 18, 1906, and for exactly 45 seconds, the Earth itself tried to erase one of America's greatest cities from the map. The ground didn't just shake, it buckled. It rolled like the surface of the ocean. Buildings that had stood for decades collapsed in seconds. Water mains exploded underground. Gas lines ruptured. And then, almost as if the earthquake wasn't enough, the fires started. What followed those 45 seconds would kill more people than the disaster itself. It would leave 300,000 Americans homeless overnight. It would expose corruption so deep it reached all the way to the halls of government. And it would force the United States to rethink how cities are built, how disasters are managed, and who actually gets to survive. But here's the thing that historians rarely talk about. The true death toll of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake was hidden, buried, deliberately covered up by the very people who were supposed to protect the survivors, and the reasons why those reasons still echo through California today. Stay with this story. Because what happened in San Francisco in April of 1906 is not just a disaster, it's a mystery, a cover-up, and one of the most consequential events in American history. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what San Francisco actually was in 1906. By the turn of the 20th century, San Francisco wasn't just a city. It was the crown jewel of the American West. Everything east of the Mississippi had Chicago, Boston, New York cities that had been built over centuries. But San Francisco had risen from almost nothing in fewer than 60 years, and it had done it with staggering speed and staggering arrogance. Gold had started it. The 1849 gold rush turned a sleepy little port into a boomtown almost overnight. Hundreds of thousands of people from across America and around the world poured into Northern California chasing fortune. Most of them didn't find gold, but many of them stayed, and the city they built together was something genuinely extraordinary. By 1906, San Francisco had a population of around 400,000 people. It was the 9th largest city in the United States. It had a world-class opera house. It had palatial hotels that could rival anything in New York. It had Chinatown, one of the largest Chinese-American communities in the entire country. It had cable cars running up its famous hills. It had newspapers, universities, banks, and an electric street railway system that was the envy of cities twice its size. It was also, by nearly every measure, a city living on borrowed time. Geologists today know what the people of 1906 didn't fully appreciate. San Francisco sits right on top of the San Andreas Fault. This enormous fracture in the Earth's crust runs nearly 800 miles through California, and it is one of the most seismically active fault lines on the entire planet. The city wasn't just near the fault in places, the fault ran directly beneath it. There had been earthquakes before. Small ones. Frequent ones. San Franciscans had grown almost casual about them. They called them rollers and shakers and went about their day. The city had experienced a significant quake in 1868 that damaged buildings and killed people, and the engineers and city planners had looked at the damage, noted their concern, and then mostly moved on. The real estate market was too hot, the money was too good, and nobody wanted to be the one to say that this magnificent, expensive, profitable city might be sitting on a time bomb. There was one man who tried to warn them. His name was Andrew Lawson, a geology professor at UC Berkeley. He had been mapping the fault system for years and had growing concerns about San Francisco's vulnerability. His warnings were politely ignored. The boosters, the businessmen, the politicians they had, too much invested in the idea of San Francisco as an unconquerable city to take the bad news seriously. And so the city grew. And grew. And the fault beneath it stayed quiet, storing energy, building pressure, year after year after year. Then came April 18th. The night of April 17th was a Tuesday. San Francisco's Grand Opera House had just hosted a performance by the famous tenor Enrico Caruso, one of the most celebrated singers in the world. The audience had been electric, the performance magnificent. Caruso himself stayed at the Palace Hotel, one of the most luxurious buildings in the city. He went to sleep that night satisfied, unaware that in a few hours he would flee into the street in terror, screaming that he would never return to this city again. He never did. At 5:12 am on April 18th, the earth broke. The rupture began about 296 miles north of the city and traveled south at nearly 2 miles per second. The San Andreas Fault shifted by as much as 20 feet in some places. That violent, sudden movement sent seismic waves radiating outward in every direction, and when those waves reached San Francisco, the results were catastrophic. Witnesses described sounds they had never heard before and could never forget. A deep, low roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the shaking not just up and down, but sideways, violent and lurching, like the city was being grabbed by invisible hands and shaken like a child's toy. Buildings made of brick crumbled almost immediately. The unreinforced masonry that filled block after block downtown turned into cascading rubble within seconds. Fire stations, the very places that would be needed most in the minutes that followed, were themselves destroyed. Horses in the stables were crushed. Equipment was buried under debris. On Valencia Street, something even stranger happened. The ground was built on unstable filled land, what engineers call liquefaction-prone soil. When the waves hit, the soil essentially turned to liquid. An entire 4-story hotel simply sank into the earth. The first floor disappeared underground. Survivors inside found themselves on what had been the second floor, now at street level, crawling out into a world that no longer made any sense. In Chinatown, centuries-old wooden buildings twisted off their foundations. In the financial district, ornate bank buildings shed their facades like skin. The new City Hall, a structure that had taken 27 years and nearly $6 million to build, had its dome survive, but its walls and columns collapsed completely, exposing the internal skeleton like a gutted fish. It was later revealed that corrupt contractors had used substandard materials and pocketed the difference. The earthquake didn't just destroy City Hall. It exposed exactly why City Hall had always been a fraud. But the earthquake, as terrifying as it was, would not be the worst of what was coming. Because in the minutes after the shaking stopped, something rose over the city. Smoke. It started in dozens of places at once. Gas lines had ruptured throughout the city. Stoves had been knocked over in kitchens where breakfast was just beginning. Sparks from broken electrical lines ignited debris. And in one particularly devastating case, a woman on Hayes Street tried to cook breakfast on her stove shortly after the quake, not realizing that the chimney had been destroyed. The fire caught, spread to her neighbors, and the blaze that resulted became known, grimly, as the Hammond Eggs Fire. It would destroy 30 blocks before it finally burned itself out. But the fires were only half the problem. The other half was the water. When the earthquake struck, it ruptured more than 300 water mains beneath the city's streets. The fire department, already crippled by destroyed stations and dead horses, raced to plug into hydrants across the city and found nothing. Empty pipes. No pressure. No water. The system that was supposed to protect San Francisco from exactly this kind of disaster had been destroyed by the disaster itself. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had actually warned about this exact scenario. For years he had advocated for a separate, earthquake-proof water supply system, for the city cisterns built into the streets that could supply water even if the main system failed. He had been denied funding, again and again, by a city government more interested in other priorities. Tragically, Chief Sullivan himself had been critically injured in the first moments of the earthquake when a chimney from a neighboring building collapsed through the roof of his fire station quarters. He died 4 days later, never regaining consciousness, never seeing the inferno that consumed his city in the hours he was fighting for his life. The fires burned for 3 days. 3 days. Firefighters resorted to dynamiting entire city blocks in an attempt to create firebreaks gaps in the urban fabric that the fire couldn't jump. But many of these demolitions were botched. Improperly placed charges actually spread the fire rather than stopping it. Buildings that might have survived were deliberately destroyed. And in the chaos, decisions were being made by people who had no training in disaster management and no experience with anything on this scale. The army was called in under General Frederick Funston, who took it upon himself without any direct authorization from Washington to declare martial law over the city. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Anyone found looting could be shot on sight. And some were. By the time the last fire was extinguished on April 21st, the damage was almost incomprehensible. More than 25,000 buildings had been destroyed. An area of 500 city blocks, roughly 4 square miles, had been reduced to ash and rubble. The financial district, the residential neighborhoods south of Market Street, Chinatown, the waterfront, all of it, gone. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people never hear about. The question of how many people actually died. In the immediate aftermath, city officials announced a death toll. The number they gave was 478. That was the official figure for years. Decades, in fact. It appeared in textbooks, in encyclopedias, in official government records. 478 dead. But researchers who began digging into the actual records in the late 20th century found something that should have been impossible. The real number was nowhere close to 478. Modern estimates, based on newspaper accounts, hospital records, burial records, and survivor testimonies, put the actual death toll somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people. Some historians believe it may have been even higher. The official figure of 478 wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And understanding why that choice was made tells you more about America in 1906 than almost anything else. Here's the thing about San Francisco in 1906. It was also a city of enormous wealth and enormous investment. Railroads, banks, shipping companies, real estate developers, billions of dollars were tied up in California's economic future. And the moment word spread that San Francisco had been catastrophically destroyed, the financial markets began to panic. The people with money and power in San Francisco and the people in Washington who answered to them understood something very clearly. If the true scale of the disaster became known, investment would flee. Insurance companies would go bankrupt paying out claims, property values would collapse, the entire economy of the American West Coast could go into freefall. So the decision was made to manage the information. City officials, real estate interests, and powerful businessmen pushed back hard against accurate reporting. They insisted the fires were the primary cause of destruction, not the earthquake. This was critically important because earthquake damage was often explicitly excluded from insurance policies, while fire damage was covered. If it was officially a fire disaster rather than an earthquake disaster, insurance companies could be compelled to pay. And if the city downplayed the earthquake, it could more easily attract the investment it needed to rebuild. And the deaths, those were managed too. Because a significant portion of the people who died lived in the poorest neighborhoods. In Chinatown, in the working-class districts south of Market Street. These were not people with powerful advocates. These were immigrants, laborers, the urban poor. Their deaths were harder to count, easier to ignore, and politically inconvenient to acknowledge. But hidden in the records was something even darker that almost nobody talks about. When General Funston declared effective martial law over San Francisco, the soldiers and police who flooded into the city had enormous power. Power over who got food and water. Power over who got protected and who got left behind. Power over life and death. Chinatown presented a particular opportunity for certain powerful interests who had long resented the Chinese-American community's presence in such valuable real estate in the heart of the city. Within days of the earthquake, there were serious efforts by city officials to permanently relocate San Francisco's Chinese residents to a distant, less desirable part of the city. The earthquake had destroyed Chinatown. Here was a chance, some argued, to make sure it was never rebuilt, at least not where it had stood. The Chinese-American community and the Chinese government pushed back hard. Chinese diplomats in Washington applied pressure at the federal level. Community leaders organized. And ultimately, the relocation effort failed. Chinatown was rebuilt on its original site. It still stands there today, one of the most visited neighborhoods in all of San Francisco. But the episode revealed something chilling. That even in the middle of a catastrophe, even when thousands were dead and hundreds of thousands were homeless, the machinery of discrimination kept running. The disaster didn't pause the politics of exclusion. For some people in power, it looked like an opportunity. And this was not the only injustice hiding inside the earthquake's rubble. There were reports documented, verified reports of soldiers shooting civilians during the martial law period. Some of these were looters. Some were people who had returned to their homes to retrieve valuables. Some may simply have been in the wrong place at the wrong moment during a chaotic, terrifying situation where young soldiers had been told to shoot first and ask questions later. The official number of civilians killed by soldiers was never clearly established. It was another number that nobody in power particularly wanted to count. The investigation that followed the disaster was one of the first large-scale scientific studies of earthquake damage in American history. The Lawson Report, named after the same Andrew Lawson who had tried to warn the city before the quake, was a comprehensive scientific analysis of the fault, the seismic waves, and the destruction patterns. It was groundbreaking work. It established many of the foundational principles of modern earthquake science. And then, for decades, it was largely ignored. This is one of the most maddening patterns in this story. After every new piece of knowledge was gained, after every lesson was written down, the system found ways to push it to the side when it became inconvenient. Building codes were strengthened, but enforcement was inconsistent. The city was rebuilt quickly, which was economically necessary, but speed meant that some of the same structural vulnerabilities were reproduced. The water system was improved, but the city's water infrastructure would remain a source of concern for generations. Insurance companies that had initially tried to deny claims based on it was an earthquake, not a fire technicality, eventually paid out. But the episode sparked a legal and regulatory reckoning about what disaster insurance actually meant in America. And politically, the earthquake accelerated several changes that were already simmering. The corruption exposed by the collapse of City Hall and other poorly built structures fueled a wave of progressive reformers who swept through San Francisco's political establishment in the years that followed. Abe Rueff, the political boss who had run San Francisco's corrupt patronage machine, was prosecuted for bribery in a trial that riveted the nation. The earthquake hadn't caused that corruption, but it had stripped away the walls hiding it. There's a theory among urban historians, and it's a compelling one, that the 1906 earthquake was actually a turning point not just for San Francisco, but for the relationship between American cities and the federal government. Before 1906, the idea of the federal government playing a significant role in disaster response was almost non-existent. Cities were expected to handle their own problems. The federal government might offer sympathy, but organized federal disaster relief was not a concept that really existed. After San Francisco, that began to change. The scale of the catastrophe was simply too large for any single city or state to handle alone. Congress began debating the appropriate federal role in disaster response debates that would eventually, many decades later, lead to the creation of formalized federal disaster relief structures and eventually FEMA itself. San Francisco 1906 planted the seed. It would take decades to grow, but the earthquake made Americans confront a new reality. Some disasters are simply too big for local government to handle alone. Here's something that rarely makes it into the history books. In the weeks after the earthquake, as survivors huddled in tent cities in Golden Gate Park and other open spaces around the city, a peculiar social experiment was unfolding. The normal rules of San Francisco society had been suspended. Wealthy families were camping next to working-class immigrants. People who had never spoken to their neighbors were sharing food and water and stories. Sociologists who studied the refugee camps noted something unexpected. Crime was remarkably low. Community cooperation was remarkably high. People were, in many cases, kinder to each other in the disaster camps than they had been in their normal daily lives. The same pattern has been documented in disasters since researchers call it disaster utopia, the strange phenomenon where catastrophe strips away social barriers and brings out genuine human solidarity. It didn't last, of course. As the months passed and the city began to rebuild, the old divisions reasserted themselves. The poor went back to struggling. The wealthy went back to their mansions. Chinatown was once again viewed with suspicion by certain quarters of the establishment. But for a few weeks in the spring and summer of 1906, something remarkable happened in those tent cities. And some of the people who lived through it would describe those weeks for the rest of their lives as the most human time they ever experienced. There is also the strange story of Enrico Caruso, the great tenor, who fled San Francisco in panic after the quake. Clutching a signed portrait of Theodore Roosevelt as if it were a talisman that could protect him, he ran into a friend on the street in the middle of the chaos, and according to the friend's account, Caruso kept repeating one phrase over and over: "Give me Vesuvius." He was referring to the volcano near Naples, preferring, apparently, the familiar dangers of Italy to the terrifying and alien disaster of California. He never returned to San Francisco. He toured the country and the world for another 15 years until his death in 1921, but San Francisco was forever off his itinerary. And then there is the story of the firefighters who discovered, in the middle of the chaos, a block on Kearny Street that appeared to be untouched houses standing, relatively intact, while everything around them burned. Investigation revealed that the residents of that block, acting on their own initiative in the first hours after the quake, had formed a bucket brigade using wine from their cellars. Wine, red wine, passed in pots and pans and anything else they could find, thrown onto the smoldering edges of approaching flame. It had worked. The alcohol-soaked strategy, born of desperation, had saved an entire city block when there was no water to be had. Nobody told them to do it. Nobody organized it. A community in crisis had simply looked at what they had and figured out how to survive. Now, here is where this story gets even more interesting. Because the 1906 earthquake didn't just reshape San Francisco. It reshaped the state of California in ways that still affect millions of people today. The disaster triggered one of the largest internal migrations in American history up to that point. Hundreds of thousands of people left San Francisco, and many of them went south, to a small but growing city on the coast of Southern California, a city that, just a few years before, had been considered a kind of backwater compared to the glittering sophistication of San Francisco. That city was Los Angeles. In 1900, San Francisco had roughly 343,000 people. Los Angeles had 102,000. San Francisco was the dominant city of the West Coast by every measure culturally, economically, politically. Los Angeles was a distant second. After 1906, the dynamic began to shift. Refugees from San Francisco flooded into Los Angeles. Capital that might have stayed in the Bay Area moved south. Industries reconsidered their locations, and over the following decades, Los Angeles grew with extraordinary speed, while San Francisco rebuilt more slowly. By 1920, Los Angeles had surpassed San Francisco in population. By 1930, the gap was enormous. The earthquake hadn't caused this by itself. Los Angeles had real advantages in climate, land, and its own boosterism. But the disaster accelerated a shift of economic and demographic gravity southward that permanently altered California's identity. And Los Angeles, in turn, would go on to become home to Hollywood, the entertainment industry that would define American culture for the rest of the 20th century. Would Hollywood have ended up in Los Angeles if the earthquake hadn't reshuffled California's deck? It's impossible to know for certain. But the connection between San Francisco's catastrophe and Los Angeles's rise is real and documented and almost entirely absent from popular historical memory. The earthquake also accelerated California's transformation into a force in national politics. The scale of the disaster drew federal attention to California in new ways. The progressive political reforms that emerged from the earthquake's exposure of corruption gave California a reputation for civic innovation. By the 1910s, California had become one of the most politically dynamic states in the country, enacting progressive reforms on labor, women's suffrage, and direct democracy that influenced the rest of the nation. The earthquake didn't create California's political culture, but it blew the doors open. Let's go back to something that still doesn't have a completely satisfying answer. Why was the death toll covered up? Not just minimized, but actively suppressed? We've talked about the economic reasons, the insurance reasons. But there is another layer to this story that goes deeper. In 1906, the United States had a particular relationship with the idea of disaster. The country was in the middle of what historians call the Progressive Era, a period of optimism, reform, and a firm belief in human progress and the power of technology and organization to solve any problem. America was building skyscrapers. America was building the Panama Canal. America had just defeated Spain in war and was establishing itself as a global power. The idea that an entire American city could simply be destroyed not by an enemy army, not by human failure, but by the earth itself, by a force completely beyond human control, was psychologically devastating in a way that went beyond the physical destruction. If the earthquake could destroy San Francisco, what did that say about all the other cities Americans had built? About the confidence with which they had built them? About the belief that American civilization was on an inevitable upward march? Minimizing the death toll wasn't just about insurance money or real estate values, it was also about maintaining a national narrative. About telling America and the world that yes, something terrible happened, but we are already rebuilding, we are already recovering, we are not broken, we are not defeated, we are not afraid. The cover-up was, in a strange way, a form of national myth-making, and like all myths, it required hiding things that complicated the story. What was hidden, most of all, were the people who didn't fit the story of resilient, triumphant San Francisco rising from the ashes. The poor, the immigrants, the Chinese, the people who couldn't afford to rebuild, the people who left and never came back, the people who are only numbers in a death toll that we still don't know with certainty, more than 100 years later. In 1989, San Francisco experienced another major earthquake. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck on October 17th, during of all things the warm-up for Game 3 of the World Series being played between the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland Athletics. The whole country was watching. The 1989 quake killed 63 people and caused billions of dollars in damage. It was a serious disaster. But the fact that it killed only 63 people in a city of hundreds of thousands was a testament to how much had changed since 1906. Building codes, seismic retrofitting, emergency response systems, public awareness, all of it had been built, layer by layer, on the lessons learned from 1906. And yet, seismologists will tell you that the Bay Area remains highly vulnerable. The Hayward Fault, which runs directly under several densely populated East Bay cities, is considered by many experts to be the fault most likely to produce a major earthquake in the coming decades. Models suggest that a major Hayward Fault quake could kill thousands and cause damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars. California has spent billions on earthquake preparedness since 1906. And yet, seismologists consistently warn that the preparation is still not enough. Buildings that were retrofitted in the 1980s and 90s may not meet current standards. Water systems remain vulnerable. Emergency planning for a truly catastrophic event remains incomplete. The 1906 earthquake changed America. It changed building codes. It changed insurance law. It changed federal disaster policy. It helped reshape the demographic geography of an entire state. It toppled corrupt governments and accelerated progressive reform. It contributed to the rise of Los Angeles. It planted seeds that eventually grew into the modern federal emergency management system. And yet, in some fundamental ways, we have not fully learned its deepest lesson. Which is this: When you build a civilization on top of a geological time bomb, the time bomb does not negotiate. It does not care about economics. It does not respond to political pressure or optimistic narratives or the sheer scale of what you have built. It waits. And one day, it reminds you who is actually in charge. The real final revelation of this story isn't about politics or demographics or insurance fraud. It's about a photograph. In the collection of the California Historical Society, there is a photograph taken in the days after the earthquake. It shows a wide street in what was once a residential neighborhood. Everything is rubble and ash. In the middle of the street, surrounded by destruction as far as the camera can see in any direction, a man is sitting in a chair. He is wearing a suit. He is reading a newspaper. We don't know who he is. Nobody has ever identified him. We don't know if he pulled that chair out of the wreckage of his own home or found it in the street. We don't know what newspaper he was reading or what he was thinking as he sat there in the middle of all that ruin. But something about that image has haunted everyone who has ever seen it. Because it looks, on its surface, almost absurd. A man reading a newspaper in the rubble of a destroyed city, with the sky still grey with smoke above him. And yet, he is still there. He is still reading. Life, stubborn and inexplicable, going on. That's San Francisco, 1906. That's the story underneath the story. Not the official death toll or the insurance fraud or the political reshuffling or even the way the disaster remapped American history. Those things matter. They're real. They deserve to be known. But the core of it, the heart of this catastrophe, is that 300,000 people went to sleep one night in the greatest city of the American West and woke up in a tent city. And most of them stayed. And most of them rebuilt. And the city that rose from that rubble went on to become one of the most iconic places on earth. The cover-up happened. The injustice happened. The politics happened. The corruption happened. And the man sat in his chair and read his newspaper. America looked at San Francisco in ruins and chose to believe it would survive. That belief, as flawed and self-serving and politically convenient as it often was, turned out to be true. Which leaves one question, one that seismologists and urban planners and emergency managers still wrestle with today, more than a century later. If the San Andreas Fault or the Hayward Fault produces a major rupture tomorrow, if the earthquake that geologists say is not a matter of if but when finally arrives, will the America of 2025 respond the way it did in 1906? Will it count the dead, honestly? Will it protect the most vulnerable? Will it let science lead? Or will economics and politics once again decide what the truth is allowed to be? The fault is still there, loaded with energy. Waiting. The question isn't whether another earthquake is coming to California. The question is whether we've actually learned anything since the last one.